My ex-boyfriend had heart surgery. I was the surgeon in charge. His current girlfriend was afraid of my revenge and insisted on a change of surgeon. Without saying a word, I called in all the doctors from the cardiology department and chose one. I had taught them all. Later, his heart stopped beating in my hands. Robert was unconscious when he was brought to the cardiology department in the early morning. I glanced at Mary, who was holding his hand tightly, and turned to instruct the nurses and interns on the examination. "Why is it you?" Mary screamed when she saw me, and glared at me, indicating her unwillingness to see me. I didn't have time to pay any attention to her. While I was examining Robert, I asked someone to prepare the operating room, but she wouldn't give up. She came over and grabbed me. "You can't operate on him. I demand a replacement." I broke free of her grip. I kept working. I was the only doctor on duty tonight. Mary choked. After she recovered, she grabbed my wrist again and wouldn't let me operate on Robert. I called for them to come over. "It definitely wasn't going to be you." I laughed in exasperation. I didn't bother to say anything more to her. I used her hand to push her aside. "What he needs now is resuscitation. Every minute of delay will cost him his life. You can call someone else if you want. But can you bear the consequences?" She stopped yelling. She stood to the side, took out her phone and filmed every move I made with Robert. I raced against time to give Robert first aid. I rushed him to the operating room. The surgery lasted 5 hours. It was dawn when it was over. "Jenny. Going to breakfast? There's a new beef noodle shop across the street from the hospital. I hear it's pretty good." The anesthesiologist, Thomas, followed me out of the operating room. The young man was tall, with bushy eyebrows and big eyes, and looked young and energetic. After a night of work, his skin looked better than mine. I declined his invitation and said I just wanted to go home and take a nap. Thomas didn't leave, but came up to me instead. "Jenny, do you know the patient who had the sandwich?" I raised my eyebrows and gave him a teasing glance. "Thomas, are you always this nosy?" It had been a month since I started working at the San Jose hospital. Thomas and I are not very familiar with each other. But this guy is good at everything, except keeping his mouth shut. And I have already experienced this well-known rumor firsthand. Thomas gave a cheeky look and laughed out loud, and then deliberately lowered his voice. "Just out of curiosity, you were looking at him in the operating room just now with a different look than at the other patients." I paused and suppressed the urge to ask him how he could tell, and gave him a look that told him to figure it out himself, and walked away. I never expected to run into Robert in San Francisco. Normally, he would be on a plane to South Korea to compete in a Go tournament. Of course, none of this is my business. We broke up 2 years ago anyway. When he left that day, holding Mary's hand, he was already dead to me. When I woke up and went to work, Robert was already awake. Mary wasn't there. He was lying alone in the hospital bed. When he saw me come in, his eyes glued to me and never moved. I took a few interns on a ward round. I checked his condition as a matter of routine. I asked some questions. He opened his mouth and stuttered his reply, but there was a stubborn and serious streak in him, as if he was a child desperately trying to win praise. He was almost 30 years old, and on the surface still looked very obedient. I sneered inwardly and pretended not to see. "Why bother? You were the one who wanted to break up in the first place, Robert." After the procedure was over, I turned and left. As I was about to leave, I heard a low voice behind me. "Jenny." It sounded a bit aggrieved. I stopped in my tracks, took a deep breath. I dismissed all the interns and then returned to the ward. When Robert saw me return, his originally gloomy eyes lit up again. I remained unmoved and stood 1 meter away from the bed, looking down at him condescendingly. I said coldly, "That's enough. Stop pretending. Your surgery was a success. As your ex-girlfriend, I hope you die. But as a doctor, I will let you live." I don't know if it was my imagination, but I felt that after I said this, Robert's face turned pale again. I turned around and walked out. "It's okay. I'm leaving. If you need anything, Call the nurse. Before I could take 2 steps, Robert's voice, slightly hoarse, came again. Jenny. Don't go. I know I was wrong. I've always been soft-hearted. If he had said that to me 2 years ago, I might have given him a chance to explain. But now, I raised the corners of my mouth and left the ward without looking back. Some people may seem honest on the surface, but they are more devious than anyone else behind closed doors. Even though his current girlfriend was right there, he still wanted to play the ex-girlfriend confessing her sins card. Chin Shimmy is not as lucky as he thinks. He really thinks I'm an idiot who can be fooled. He'll fall into the same trap twice. I kept my face straight and returned to the office after checking all the wards. There was a tin of biscuits on my desk. A note was stuck on top. Found a really delicious biscuit. Have a snack when you're hungry. The bold, brash font told me it was from Thomas without a signature. My face softened a little. I opened the tin and crunched and bit into a biscuit. It did taste good. It's just a bit too sweet. And if you eat too much, it gets old. And as I think about it, Robert's face comes to mind. He really likes sweet things. He orders 2 strawberry mousses on every date. I stop chewing and feel like having a brain removal operation. When Robert isn't around, I can completely forget about this person. But as soon as he shows up, he won't go away. It feels really weird. It's like someone I buried suddenly dug up their grave and came back to life. It's disgusting and annoying. I was 29 when I met Robert. I had just returned from abroad to San Francisco. I found a roommate in Mary, who I had been on friendly terms with in high school. Later, on Mary's birthday, she dragged me to dinner with her childhood friend Robert. When I was young, I was obsessed with Korean dramas for a while. One of my favorite dramas had a genius young Go player as the male lead. At that time, Robert was 25 years old and was already the youngest Go player in the country with the 9th Dan. So even though he remained silent throughout the meal, I just had an inexplicable fondness for him. At some point later, Robert added me on WeChat. We occasionally chatted a bit. He would also sometimes join Mary and I for dinner. As we got to know each other, he gradually started to talk more. But most of the time, he was still quiet. But he was very obedient. When we were talking, he would look at us intently. He would also help me pick out the chives and cilantro for my food. I think I was charmed by Robert's harmless appearance back then. So it wasn't long before I went and confessed my feelings to him. Robert listened to my confession expressionlessly and stared at me for a long time before turning and walking away, leaving me all alone in the wind. A week after my heartbreak, Robert came to the hospital to see me with a bouquet of flowers and the trophy he had won first place in the Go competition the week before, as our token of love. And that's how we got together. At the time, I didn't know that he had given all the other trophies to Mary. The office door suddenly opened, and the head of the department staggered in carrying a thermos. He looked at me and smacked his lips. Ouch. Jenny. You're still sitting here. You've been complained about. Did you know that? I was unmoved. I lowered my eyes and pinched another piece of biscuit. There are a lot of people who complain about me. Mostly for one reason. Bad attitude. It's no big deal. People say you're not a good doctor. The director said again in a light tone. The biscuit in my hand crunched into several small pieces. Saying I have a bad attitude. I accept it. Saying I'm not a good doctor. I'll fight him to the death. Who is the family of Bed 6? Bed 6 is Robert. Only Mary dared to tell such a blatant lie. The director didn't say a word, but the fire of gossip burned fiercely in her smiling eyes. Before he could ask, I stuffed the cookies into his arms and rushed out, straight to Robert's room. When I knocked on the door and entered, Mary was feeding Robert his meal. But Robert didn't even open his mouth. I stood by the door and looked at them from a distance. With a cold face I asked, "Are you feeling unwell?" Mary's face changed when she saw me, and stood in front of Robert like she was defending a baby. Like an old hen protecting her chicks. Afraid that I might do something to him. Jenny. Did you do something to him? Why won't Robert eat a single mouthful of rice? although her tone was questioning. She was completely different from the bossy person she was yesterday. And looked completely sad and aggrieved. She always acted like this in front of Robert. Speaking in a soft voice. As if she had a lump in her throat. I can't believe I didn't notice it back then. Or I was careless. But I had actually asked Mary if she liked Robert. At the time. She acted very exaggeratedly. And even looked at me with disdain in her eyes. Are you kidding me? How could I like him? I still remember her tone of voice. It sounded as if Robert was completely unlovable. Afterwards. When Robert and I got together. She didn't say anything. But she was always around whenever we went out. As if she were protecting the love of her two best friends. In reality. Robert and I were both busy most of the time. He was either at the chess academy thinking about chess or going to competitions all over the world to play chess. While I was basically running between various operating tables every day. Plus Mary was stirring things up. During the year we were in love. Robert and I basically had no time for each other. Now that 2 years have passed. Robert and I broke up. But she's still by Robert's side. I thought she was an outsider. But I didn't realize that I was the one. It's really ironic. He just had surgery. It's normal to have no appetite. I glanced at the bowl she was holding in her hands. It looked delicious. But it was all meat. With no green leaves. Not to mention. The nurse didn't tell you to avoid greasy and spicy food. Mary glanced down at the bowl of food. Her face turned red. She turned around. Put down the bowl and went to spoon some soup for Robert to drink. Robert, who had been blocked by her, appeared in front of me. But it was just the back of his head. He was turning his head to look out the window. TSK. Yesterday. When Mary wasn't here. She apologized to me eagerly. Today. She won't even turn her head. I leisurely lean against the door. And watch what they're going to do. Mary brings the soup spoon to Robert's lips. And coaxes him to drink a little. He still doesn't respond. Mary seems to have found another reason to attack me. She straightens up and becomes aggressive. If you won't eat the food. You won't even drink the soup. And you say it's not a problem with your treatment. I already sent the video I recorded yesterday to your home manager. We'll see how you can explain yourself then. I'm speechless. Before. I thought she was quite clever. Now I feel like she's missing a brainstem. She's stirring up trouble and dragging the hospital into it. She's not afraid of being embarrassed. She's not eating. I folded my arms. I looked at the back of Robert's head and sneered. Just starved to death. My mother always scolded me for being heartless. My heart is cold like ice. You can't warm it. The day after I broke up with Robert. I went to work as usual and performed an operation. My life was unaffected. So I always thought it was only natural that I wouldn't feel anything when I saw Robert and Mary again. But I overestimated myself. If I ran this hospital, I would have thrown them out with their beds. It's not that I still like Robert very much. It's just that when I see them, I think of my stupid self. They are like a mirror. They tell me all the time how stupid and blind I was back then. I don't know when they started seeing each other behind my back. The day I caught them holding hands. Coincidentally was my birthday. It was also New Year's Eve. That night. The hospital was actually very busy. But Robert and I hadn't seen each other for almost half a month. We were in the same city. But it was like we were in long-distance relationship. It so happened that Robert had just finished a competition that day. So I specially asked a colleague to swap shifts. And I booked a hotel in advance. I wanted to spend some quality time with Robert. But as soon as I arrived at the hotel entrance, I saw Robert holding Mary's hand and getting into the elevator. The blood that was boiling in my body suddenly went from my head to my toes. I took the next elevator and followed them upstairs. The elevator door opened. And I saw them hugging in front of the room door. I froze in the elevator. Until the elevator door slowly closed. And sent me back to the first floor. I originally wanted to go up and give each of them a slap in the face. The hospital called and said there was not enough staff. And asked me to hurry back as much as possible. I had to go back to work again. After waiting for a day and a night. There were many missed calls on my phone. All from Robert. The latest was a message. Let's break up. I've always liked Mary. I was tired and hungry. and exhausted. I didn't even bother to say a word to him and just blocked him and Mary. I went back to bed and took a nap. I moved out of the house I shared with Mary overnight. That's when Mary revealed her true colors. She apologized to me insincerely. And apologized to me on Robert's behalf. Saying that he had fallen in love with me because she had rejected him. And that he was just trying to upset her. She even thanked me. Saying that I had made her realize that she liked Robert. And that she couldn't control her feelings and confess her love to him. I thought Robert would consider my feelings and not accept her confession. But I never expected Robert to break up with me so decisively. As I listened to her empty words, I didn't even frown. I quickly packed my things. I even gave her a watch when I left. For your reputation. I still remember Mary's face. Turning as red as a pig's liver. Of course. In the end. The hospital didn't determine that my complaint was my problem. Our director simply dismissed it. But over the past 2 days, my colleagues have been looking at me strangely. Some of them want to say something but hold back, while others discuss it behind my back. But because of my usual aloof demeanor, no one dares to say anything to my face. Actually, I'm curious. What else could it be? Thomas lowered his head and took a sip of the powdered soup. And after swallowing, he covered his stomach with his hands and sighed before continuing. They all say that bed number 6 outside the heart is your ex-boyfriend. Tall and handsome. And a genius at go. He winked at me. And everyone is guessing why you two broke up. I gave him a fleeting glance. Is everyone guessing? Or are you trying to ask? Thomas raised an eyebrow. And admitted without any hesitation that it was him. I was curious. I didn't say anything. And kept my head bowed as I slurped the noodles. He didn't care. And kept eating as he shared the latest news from each department of the hospital with me. After the meal, we walked out of the beef noodle shop. And turned the corner back to the hospital. The red light lasted nearly 2 minutes. I stood on the curb and turned my head to look at Thomas by my side. His face was bathed in the sunlight. And his lips were curled in his usual smile. He was a complete contrast to Robert. He is funny. Has a high emotional intelligence. And is popular. It seems like he is always full of hope. I never need to find a topic of conversation when I'm with him. Even if he were the only one talking. It would never get boring. Thomas feels my gaze. He turns his head and smiles at me. Do you think I look a little better today? I smile back. Thomas. Do you like me? Although I haven't been in many relationships. I'm still a little sensitive when it comes to love in my 30s. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Thomas is taken aback. His eyes dart around a bit. And then laughed softly. Is it that obvious? He admitted it. I didn't say anything. I turned my head to look at the red light, which had 60 seconds left. You should find someone else. I have no plans to get married or fall in love right now. This is the truth. It's not that I don't like Thomas. He's very nice. I just don't want to start a relationship right now. We're not in our 20s anymore. Everyone is looking to get married and start a family. In that case, let's just be honest. Don't waste each other's time. The 2-year gap didn't make me want to fall in love more. Instead, I feel pretty good being single. Although I haven't been home for the New Year's holiday for 2 years. My mother says, I'm not allowed to come home until I find someone to marry. Thomas is also staring at the red light across the street. For a long time. He doesn't say anything. 10-9. 86. 4-3. 1. The green light comes on. Pedestrians hurry past us. I hear his voice with a smile. Then I'll wait a bit longer. Originally, I planned to cross the street and talk to Thomas. But as soon as I reached the hospital entrance, I saw Mary and a well-dressed man holding hands. They looked like they were reluctant to part. The suit on the man looked expensive. He held Mary's hand. And looked at her with deep affection in his eyes. Huh. Things are starting to get interesting. I took Thomas around the main entrance. And walked to the side entrance around the corner. I took 2 photos of Mary's face without her knowing. Thomas asked behind me who it was. It's my ex-boyfriend's current girlfriend. I admired the photos on my phone. And secretly praised myself for my choice of angle. The faces of the leading man and woman are both very clear. I thought Mary liked Robert a lot. And was by his side every day. Afraid that I would take the opportunity to get close to him. It turns out that it was just a fake deep affection. So you took the pictures to show your ex-boyfriend? Thomas said sourly. I denied it. Robert's head is covered in green. The Hewlumber grassland has nothing to do with me. What I want to see is the bloody drama of Mary. Robert and the man at the door, fighting on the spot. The way that man looked. He probably doesn't even know that he's the third party. I'm looking forward to his reaction. Thomas walked with me to the door of the Heartbreak office. It was lunchtime. No one was in yet. I reiterated my principle of not getting involved in relationships. I sincerely advised him to try someone else. I even planned to recommend a few of the nurse sisters I had met at the Central Hospital. The smile at the corner of his mouth finally collapsed. He stared at me helplessly and sighed. He reached out and pressed down on the phone I was recommending to a friend. At that moment. Sister Xing. I'm not as heartless as you think. Then. I hadn't had time to speak. When the office door suddenly slammed open. And Robert stood in the doorway. Pale as a sheet. With dark eyes that glanced at Thomas. And then fixed on the hand we were still holding together. I frowned. And pulled back the hand that Thomas was holding down. Why are you here? The inpatient department is downstairs. Robert's eyes flickered. And he looked at me before glancing away. He didn't say a word as he walked in. And took hold of my hand. Jenny. That pathetic voice again. I impatiently pulled back my hand. And took 2 steps back. If you have something to say. Say it. Don't touch me. Thomas came over and stood between me and Robert. But Robert didn't even look at him. His hand was still outstretched. Eager to reach around him and grab me. But he couldn't. He was about the same height as Thomas. I tilted my head. And looked over Thomas's shoulder to see his eyes. He stared at me. His eyes full of eagerness. Finally. Even the corners of his eyes were red. Jenny. Don't you want me anymore? Oh, what's going on here? The girlfriend is downstairs talking about a new love. While the boyfriend is upstairs chasing after an old love. These two are really just minding their own business. Neither one losing out to the other. It's not like back then when you wanted to use me to get back at Marie. Is it? As I pondered this. The words that came out of my mouth were even more unpleasant. Robert. Save it. Lines like that are so outdated. You should at least try something new. Robert paused. There was a hint of confusion in his eyes. As if he didn't understand what I was saying. Jenny. I've been waiting for you for a long time. He looked at me and kept talking to himself. I've been waiting for your call. I've missed you so much. He spoke rapidly. And a little incoherently. Finally. Without Thomas noticing. He pushed him away. Then he took hold of my left hand with both hands. Jenny. I want to be with you. That's enough. I yelled angrily. With all my strength. I shook his hands off. I pushed him against the table. Thomas didn't dare move because of my yelling. At that moment. My anger. Which had been smoldering for a long time. Was fueled by the firewood and the new wood. But he still looked scared. He just stared at me. Still pretending. I took a deep breath. And tried to look less menacing. Is it really funny to say all this now? I'm really sick of hearing it. What are you still doing here after 2 years? Are you sick? If you are. Go see a doctor. Don't go crazy on me. Robert didn't say a word. His breathing became faster and faster. His eyes darted away from mine. Unsettled. A sneer curled my lips. Stop acting. I'm busy. I really don't want to play these silly games with you and Marie. When I'm discharged in a couple of days. We'll never see each other again. I don't want any bad luck. Robert opened his mouth. After a long pause. 3 words came out. I'm not sick. Thomas pulled out his phone and was about to call security. Robert. What are you doing here? Marie's voice sounded at the door. I glanced at her. And turned to sit back down in my seat. Leaving them with my back. Because I really didn't want to say another word to these 2 idiots. Mary came in her high heels. And instead of taking someone away. She interrogated us. You bullied him. Thomas was about to say something. But she interrupted him directly. His body is still not recovered. And he can't be stimulated, don't you know? Do you have any medical ethics? At this time, the lunch break was almost over. Doctors who went out to eat or take a break came back one after another. Everyone stretched their necks and looked in. I don't want this trivial matter to become public knowledge. I turned around and just wanted to ask them to leave when I was stopped by a colleague at the door. Jenny. There's an emergency. Thomas gestured for me to go ahead. I gave him a grateful look, without even glancing at the two people poking their heads into the office, and rushed out. The new patient was quite special. He was very young, only years old, but suffered from congenital heart disease and corneal blindness. That is, he was blind. He was in a state of shock when he was brought in. Fortunately, he was rescued in time. I discussed his condition with his parents, and when I returned to the ward, he was already awake. Awake. Are you feeling unwell? While I gave him a brief examination, I reassured him. Don't worry. I'm your attending doctor. Your parents have gone to pay the bill. The teenager lying in bed blinked, without showing any rejection or discomfort, and even relaxed and curved his lips. Sister. Are you in a bad mood? I froze for a moment, and didn't reply to him. This kid is quite interesting. Instead of worrying about his own condition, but is concerned about other people's moods. I could tell. When he saw that I didn't say anything, he added, everyone's emotions are different. The way they pronounce and intone words is also different. My tense cheeks loosened slightly. I looked at the list in my hands, and tried to make my voice sound less cold and hard. Richard. Right. Thank you for your concern. You still have a tough battle to fight in a couple of days. Just rest well. Asking is meddling. He has congenital heart disease, and had open heart surgery when he was very young. However, due to limited medical conditions at the time, some residual problems were not resolved, and even new medical conditions appeared. The director and I unanimously recommended another surgery to solve all the problems. Although the risk factor is not very high, it is still considered a major surgery. After I said all this, Richard didn't seem too nervous. He obediently nodded, and his unfocused eyes curved in the direction I was speaking. Thank you, sister, for performing the surgery on me. My original anxious mood was miraculously soothed by his optimistic and positive attitude. The corners of his mouth curved up to the same arc as his. Good attitude. Keep it up. Another busy afternoon passed. I was just about to go off duty, when Thomas came looking for me again. I cut him off before he could even open his mouth. Stop. I just want to sneak out now. If there's anything, we can talk on WeChat or tomorrow. As I said, I quickly changed my clothes, picked up my bag and ran out. Thomas followed behind me. I stopped by for dinner on the way out. We walked and talked. I didn't care about him. I kept walking. I was afraid that the director would catch me working overtime. He said, about the couple who caused a scene in your office this afternoon. The girl said she wants to complain about you. Oh, what else can she do apart from that? Just forget about them. I'm not interested. Thomas, shut up. I glanced at him. I always felt that he was in a strange state. Usually, he would have changed the subject and shared other gossip with me. After getting off the elevator, we walked to the entrance of the hospital. When we were about to go our separate ways, he spoke again. But I stopped in my tracks and stood still, facing him. If you have something to say, don't mumble. Thomas took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He touched the back of his head awkwardly, and looked at me with admiration in his eyes. It's nothing. I just didn't expect your ex-boyfriend to be autistic. I blinked, doubting I was hearing things. What did you say? Thomas saw my face turn pale, and after a moment of silence, he tentatively asked. You didn't know he was autistic? My mind was a little confused. Robert was such a normal person. How could he be autistic? You've got it wrong. I laughed, not believing it for a second. Thomas frowned, and said sternly, I did some research on this in college, although I can't be completely sure. His demeanor, actions, and language do match the symptoms of an autistic person. I still refused to believe it. I tried my best to argue with him. Don't joke around. I dated him for a year. I know exactly what his situation is. He just speaks less. It's impossible that he's autistic. Thomas opened his mouth, but swallowed what he wanted to say. After a moment of silence, he said, I'm just providing you with a possibility. You can verify whether it's true or not yourself. I laughed. Thank you. But I'm not interested in getting to know someone who's already my ex-boyfriend. What's the difference between yes and no? It's enough that the betrayal is real. That's what you say. But when I got home, I couldn't help but think about what Thomas had said and the details of my previous interactions with Robert. He hardly ever looked me in the eye. I always thought it was because he was introverted and shy. He would hold my hand for a while, then let go, and then hold it again. I always thought it was because his hands tended to sweat. Later, I attributed it to the fact that he liked Mary and didn't want to be intimate with me. As for other aspects, he behaved almost like an ordinary person. But now someone told me he is an autistic person. If that's true, then what does that make me? I fell in love without knowing the real him. Mary, as his childhood sweetheart, must know. I was the only one kept in the dark. I couldn't sleep until the middle of the night. My heart was so sad I couldn't breathe. It was like 1,000,000 pounds of stone pressing down on me. Finally, I got up and called my psychologist friend in the US. I gave a brief account of Robert's situation, and she said it matched the symptoms of a mildly autistic person. And it should be the academic syndrome of autism. Although people with the academic syndrome have some communication and cognitive impairments, they are exceptionally talented in a particular field, just like Robert's talent in Go. However, she also said, as she had not observed or communicated with him in person, she could not confirm. Before hanging up the phone, she asked me, Jenny, you can always ask him yourself. Why did you have to call me? I turned my head to look at the pale sky and laughed out loud, because I was afraid to know how much I had failed in this relationship. In fact, when Thomas said it, I already believed it in my heart. I just subconsciously didn't want to admit it. I couldn't sleep anyway. So I went online to research literature and data on autism. When it got light out, I went to the hospital early. Robert was lying quietly in bed, with an honest and obedient sleeping face. I sat down in the chair next to his bed and stared at his pale and thin face. After about 10 minutes, he frowned in his sleep, opened his eyes slightly, and, on seeing me, sat bolt upright with wide eyes. As he wrapped the quilt around himself and stared at me unblinkingly, from horror to disbelief to cautiousness. Jenny. I cleared my dry throat. And Robert's eyes brightened. Before dimming again as if he had thought of something. His eyes moved away from my face and looked at the ground. He asked in a restrained whisper, Jenny, will you forgive me? I stared at him for a while before saying, Robert, I have a few questions for you, and I want you to answer me honestly and not lie. He nodded without hesitation. Are you mildly autistic? I'll get straight to the point. Robert froze for a moment, and his face, which had looked rosy from sleep, turned completely pale. But he still answered, yes. Why didn't you tell me? I want to hear the reason from him in person. After I calmed down last night, I read a lot of literature and case studies, and thought carefully about what Robert had said to me over the past 2 days. I always felt that there was something strange about it. The information said that autistic patients can achieve simple communication through later intervention. But most of them have simple minds, speak bluntly, and cannot lie. They are also very gullible. Yesterday at the office, Robert said that he had been waiting for me. He missed me. He wanted to be with me. If what he said was true, then what was going on with him and Mary? Because nobody likes sick people. His tone of voice changed. It was as if he were repeating someone else's words. Although he mostly spoke in short sentences, I always seemed to understand him quickly. Because nobody likes sick people. But he wanted me to like him. So he didn't tell me he was autistic. So he tried his best to act like a normal person in front of me. I frowned. Who told you that? Mary. I paused. My mind raced. A thought flashed through my mind. Who is Mary to you? A friend. I raised my eyebrows. Mary has always presented herself as Robert's girlfriend. In that case. What about the scene I saw back then? You said you were wrong. Wrong about what? I remember Robert's first words when he saw me again were, I was wrong. At the time. I thought he was apologizing for cheating on me. But now. I see. It was something else entirely. Robert looked up at me. He met my eyes for a moment. Then looked away quickly. I called you a lot. You didn't answer. Mary said. I was disturbing you at work. You were angry. I wanted to go and explain to you. But she said you would call me when you were done being angry. But I waited and waited. You never called. I remembered the day we broke up 2 years ago. The missed call on my phone. Robert moved over. And extended an index finger. Carefully hooked my little finger. Which was resting on my knee. Jenny. I know I was wrong. I will never disturb you at work in the future. His tone was familiar and reliant. Exactly the same as 2 years ago. In his perception. It was as if we had never broken up. He had just been waiting for me to forgive him. For 2 years. I didn't break free. Feeling his warm fingertips entwine with mine. And ask one last question. Why did you hold hands and go to the hotel? And hugging each other. Robert blinked. His eyes a little confused. It seemed like it took a few seconds for him to remember what I was talking about. I want to hold hands and hug with you. But my body resists. Mary said she would help me practice. He said. What a practice. Mary really went to great lengths. To break up Robert and I. Practicing holding hands and hugging with my boyfriend at the right time. At this point in the questioning. It is already clear. Mary has been lying. She has not been with Robert. And probably sent the breakup text from Robert's phone. She just took advantage of Robert's cognitive impairment. And my lack of knowledge. To make me misunderstand. And finally completely sever contact with Robert. And Robert. Never betrayed me from beginning to end. I stood up. And cupped Robert's face. Forcing him to look me in the eye. And telling him that from now on. He must listen to me. And not believe a word. Mary said. As for Mary. I will make her pay for what she has done. Although Robert didn't understand why. He still nodded. It was almost time for work. I let go of him and prepared to go on rounds. As I turned. I felt my sleeve being grasped. Jenny. Will you still like me? Robert kept his head tilted. His eyes were full of hope. He still remembered what Mary had told him. No one will like someone who is sick. I pondered for a while. I looked at him seriously and answered. Robert. This question. I cannot answer you now. I need to think about it. 2 years ago. I definitely liked Robert. And even now, after the misunderstanding has been cleared. I can freely admit that I still have a good impression of Robert. I like the way he looks at me intently and trusts me wholeheartedly. It makes me feel needed. But I'm not sure if I like him as a person. Or if I just like the feeling of being temporarily relied on. The world of autistic people is very simple. Once you decide on someone, you are very determined and persistent. So once I accept him, it's not just accepting him as a person. It's accepting him for the rest of his life. If I don't have enough like to support me, my rash intrusion into his world, I will only cause him harm. Robert's eyes grew a little dim. He stubbornly asked. How long will it take? I don't know either. It could be a day or 2. It could also be a few weeks. Months. Or half a year. I couldn't help reaching out and pinching his earlobe. When I've thought it over. I'll let you know. Robert seemed very confused after hearing this. He frowned. And still wouldn't let go of the hem of my shirt. There were even tears in his eyes. His gaze scattered. He asked me in a hoarse voice. Will you also leave me like my parents? Because I have a disease. And left. Me frowning. I had heard about Robert's parents from Mary. They were said to have been in a car accident on their way to work. Both were sent to the hospital, but they were unable to be saved. That year Robert was only 20 years old. At the time. Mary even asked me not to mention it in front of Robert. To avoid hurting him. But why is Robert saying something different now? Who told you this? I have a bad feeling about this. Mary. It's her again. This person has been by Robert's side for 20 or 30 years. What on earth has she been telling him? Nonsense. She said that my parents didn't like me because of my illness. And that they had left me behind. I can only be liked if I act like a normal person. Robert was talking to himself. And his eyes were even more confused. I have clearly done it. But why do you still not like me? I took a deep breath. And grabbed the hand he was holding in mine. And saved my hemline. Before resuming my seat in the chair. So what did she teach you about being a normal person? Robert quickly wrapped his palm around my hand with his other hand. As if he was afraid I would run away the next second. His eyes looked up and he reminisced. In the past. I liked repeating what other people said. She said normal people wouldn't do that. So I stopped. In the past. I didn't like talking to other people. She said normal people would respond to other people. So I tried to talk as much as possible. In the past. There were a lot of rules. From behavior to eating and going to the bathroom. After listening to him. I had a sense of how hard it is to be a normal person. After Robert finished. I moved my bottom forward a little. And rested my elbows on the edge of the bed. And held his hands with both of mine. I tilted my head to look at him. Slowly. Robert. This is not entirely correct. I deliberately slowed down my speech. To make sure he understood. You don't have to do anything deliberately to be normal. There is no standard for how everyone should live. You have always been normal. You are just sick. And need treatment. What Robert needs is a psychiatrist. Not these messy, normal regulations. I paused. And then said. Robert. Your parents love you very much. They didn't leave you because you're sick. They just went back to Jenny's world before you did. In the future. Each of us will become a Jenny. You'll see them again then. I'm not lying. Robert's parents must really love him. People with autism are usually born with it. With intervention. They can gradually adapt to social life. But the process is long and unpredictable. It's a torment for the whole family. Robert has been able to communicate with others without much difficulty. It's not something Mary can do with a few words. It must be due to the patient guidance of his parents. Robert looked at me blankly after hearing this. As if he was still digesting what I had said. I patted his hand. And told him not to worry and to think about it slowly. As for whether I still like him or not. I will give him an answer in a month. Robert then gave a faint smile. That's a good boy. My fingers are restless again. But it's really time to go to work. I had to suppress my fidgety hands. And get to work first. After checking on the patients. I was just about to go back to the office. When I was stopped by a shrill female voice. Which attracted the attention of the patients and nurses in the corridor. Mary rushed angrily up to me. And demanded. What did you say to Robert? Why won't he talk to me today? The crowd around us stood still. Transfixed. I grabbed Mary's wrist. And dragged her into the nearby safety corridor. The heavy door cut off the corridor's gazes and noise. Mary shook off my hand. What? Seducing someone else's boyfriend. And afraid of being seen. I sneered. Has Robert admitted you as his girlfriend? Mary froze for a moment. And then spoke more loudly. What do you mean? Robert and I have been in a relationship for 2 years. She tried to keep up the pretense. But I was already too tired to listen. That's enough. Don't pretend. I know everything. This time she was completely stunned. The confidence in her eyes collapsed completely. Her constantly blinking eyes revealed her guilt. I found this funny. I stared into her eyes. Wrapped my arms around myself and took a step closer to her. I tricked Robert into hiding it from me. He's autistic. It was you. Wasn't it? She took a step back. So that I happened to catch you holding hands and hugging. It's you. Isn't it? She took another step back. And sent me a breakup text on Robert's phone. It's still you. Isn't it? She leaned directly against the wall behind her. Her eyes were panicked. And her body was slumping downward. I took a step back. I didn't want to waste any more time talking to her. That's enough. I'm busy. I don't have time to waste talking to you. I'll take care of Robert from now on. You can go wherever you like. I'm taller than her. I cornered her and looked at her like I was cornering a mouse. Then I stared at her with a fierce look. And, don't ever try to instill your perverted values in Robert again. If I hear it one more time, I'll rip your mouth off. After that, I was just about to pull open the door and go back to work, when I heard Mary's voice full of resentment and hatred. Jenny, what gives you the right to? I turned around and saw her tears pouring out of her eyes like they were falling from the sky. Anyone who didn't know any better would think I had done something to her. I've been by Robert's side for 20 years. And he only gives me the slightest response when he's in a good mood. She was in a state of collapse as she spoke, her tears flowing, and her face full of resentment. You've only known him for a few years. How dare you show up and effortlessly steal all of his attention? I'm the one who grew up with him. I'm the one who taught him how to be a normal person. At this point, she even began to sob, breathing heavily. Her voice got louder and louder as she spoke. So what if I did everything in my power to break you two up? I liked him for so many years. But in the end, he came to me and said he wanted me to teach him to love someone else. I can't do it. I listened in silence and glanced at the expensive diamond ring on her right middle finger. With a sneer. If you like him so much, why are you wearing a ring someone else gave you? Mary and I were in the same class in high school. At the time, I thought she was a little girl with a bit of a temper, but not a bad heart. Later, I went abroad to study and kept in touch with her. After I returned to China, I couldn't find a place to live in Sancheng for a while, so she invited me to share her place. I never thought she would lie to me and deceive me because of Robert, and even hate me. Mary stopped crying because of my problem. She wiped her tears and raised her hand to gently stroke the diamond ring on her finger. So what if I like it? Robert has autism. Even if he acts like a normal person on the surface, it is simply impossible to have a normal relationship and life with him. Even if I like it very much, I will not marry him. I put away the smile and stared at her with cold eyes. So what do you think of Robert? A plaything? I don't. Mary put her hand down and denied it with a fierce look in her eyes. Her eye makeup, which had been smeared from crying, made her look particularly disheveled. Even glaring at me was funny. I just won't marry him. But I will always be with him. And I can take care of him for the rest of my life. I was really amused. Don't turn your head, calm down before I refute her. Mary, where do you get the face to say you like Robert? You're just trying to satisfy your own perverted sense of possession. She treats Robert like a private possession, not allowing others to covet. He is only allowed to live according to her preferences and indulge in his own world. What do you know? It was as if she had been stabbed in the heart. A shrill voice resounded through the corridor. Have you ever experienced the despair of not being able to get a word out of him no matter what you say? Do you know what it's like to be constantly on the lookout for him? Because you know he's hungry and doesn't know when to eat. And he's cold and doesn't know when to get dressed. You know nothing. So why are you giving me orders? She sneered and took out a wet wipe and mirror from her bag to gently wipe the stains off her face. Don't pretend to be so innocent here. You're not much better than me. Just wait. Spend a month with Robert and you'll be devastated. And you won't hesitate to leave him. The phone in my pocket rang. As I pulled out my phone, I pulled open the door to the safe passage. Okay. I'll wait. The call was from the director. Richard's surgery plan had been finalized. I went to his ward and had a final preoperative communication with his guardian. After the communication, his parents went to pay the bill. I glanced at Richard lying on the bed. When I came to check on him this morning, he was smiling. Why does he look so down in the dumps after just a little while? But his parents are clearly beaming. Their faces are full of uncontainable excitement and joy. Your parents look happy. What good news is there? I can't help but speak to him. Richard's unfocused eyes blinked. Lying on his side facing me. Sister, I can undergo a cornea transplant. That's good news. Why aren't you happy? I'm even more confused. Richard's eyebrows furrowed slightly. But just the thought that the stranger who donated his corneas to me might have just died made me feel sad. For a moment, I was silent. After a while I muttered. This is the continuation of life. It was lunchtime. Thomas came to eat with me as usual. I refused. He made a sound of surprise. And his eyes wandered over me. My girlfriend, who I had just seen in the hospital bed, didn't come. I laughed. I went downstairs to find Robert with takeaway food I had ordered earlier and a bag of ice. To clarify, that was not his girlfriend. Thomas froze for a moment. But with his intelligence, he quickly guessed what was going on. Yesterday's incident confirmed it. I nodded. I have to thank you for this. I'll buy you dinner sometime. His words unlocked a knot in my heart that had been there for 2 years. Thomas's expression was wonderful. He suddenly understood. Then he looked thoughtful. In the end, it all turned into a sigh. He pressed the elevator button and watched me walk out. He said helplessly, although I don't know what happened between you two. I seem to have inadvertently created a rival for myself. I turned my head, raised my hand and waved. You're a good person. Thomas gave a bitter smile, waved at me, and closed the elevator. I carried my things into Robert's room. He was sitting upright in bed. A chessboard was placed on the small table in front of him. The black and white pieces on the board seemed to be in a fierce battle. I leaned over to take a closer look. But Robert suddenly looked up at me. His eyes were full of panic. Jenny. I'm sorry. I didn't notice you come in. He lifted his hand to move the chessboard away. But I held it down. What's the rush? Let me see the chess. What's the big deal? If you didn't notice. You didn't notice. But a normal person would have noticed. I looked away from the chessboard and at him. To interrupt him. Have you forgotten what I told you yesterday? Robert blinked. Repeat it. No need to do anything special. Be normal. I guided him. So what do you want to do now? Without hesitation, he said. I want to play chess. I raised my hand and pinched his ear. Then I moved the chessboard to the side. No, now, it's time to eat. You can play chess after you've finished eating. He wanted to say something. But in the end he just quietly watched as I set up the lunch on the small table. He just held the chopsticks. But he wouldn't put the food in his mouth. I saw it in his eyes. I didn't say anything. When Robert and I were dating, this kind of thing would happen to him occasionally. It was as if he had 1,000 things to say to me. But when they came to his lips, he swallowed them back down. He did whatever I told him to do. At the time, I thought he just wanted to do what I said. But now I think he was just trying to act like a so-called normal person. Even though I had already made it clear to him that he didn't need to do that. Mary had influenced him for so many years. That he couldn't change all of a sudden. I could only guide him slowly. Step by step. After a while, I saw him struggling to pick up a grain of rice and bring it to his mouth. So I spoke up. Robert. If you don't say anything, I won't know what you're thinking. He quickly put down his chopsticks and utensils. And said anxiously. My meal time is 12:30. It's now 12:25. There are still 5 minutes left. The more he spoke, the lower his voice got. As if he were ashamed. Because this was not how a normal person behaved. I looked at the clock on the wall. And also put down my chopsticks and bowl. Okay. Then we'll eat again at 12:30. Robert didn't seem to have expected this. His eyes, staring at me, were big and bright. I got up and took out an ice pack. And asked him to lift up the hem of his shirt. Yesterday at the office, when I pushed him, I saw with my own eyes that his waist hit the corner of the desk. He definitely won't say so himself. Nor will he deal with it. By now, it should already be bruised. Robert obediently lifted up his hospital gown. To reveal a section of his waist. Sure enough. The waist pocket. A little to the right. Had turned purple and blue. I frowned. And gently applied the ice pack to that piece of skin. Just as I was about to ask him if it hurt. There was a knock at the door. A chubby, somewhat bald middle-aged man stood in the doorway. Staring blankly at Robert and me. So what? You two continue. I'll wait outside for a while. The visitor was Robert's chess teacher. He had just returned from a tournament in South Korea with his team. Robert was supposed to go too. But then an unexpected situation had arisen. If you had gone, you would have won the championship. They wouldn't have been so arrogant. He sat down next to Robert and started talking. Robert, however, ate his food at a leisurely pace. And didn't even give him a single glance. But he seemed to be used to it. He could talk for a long time even if he was alone. And told me all about the competition in a crosstalk-like manner. And even made me the butt of his jokes when it got intense. For a while. Wasn't it? For a while. Right. Eyes yes. Right. No problem. He looked at Robert and pursed his lips. In a pitiful manner. I already told you not to stay up late. Robert suddenly looked up at him. And frowned. You're disturbing our dinner. His tone was devoid of any inflection. As if he were stating a fact. David was speechless. I felt embarrassed for him. And at the same time, it was extremely amusing. I sat by Robert's bed and laughed. Robert looked at me again. I quickly hid my smile. And sat upright. He pursed his lips. A smile appeared on his lips. Then he picked up a piece of fish and put it in my bowl. Jenny. Eat your food. David was beside himself. He looked at Robert and then at me. He looked as if he had never seen anything like it before. I accepted his gaze with grace. I even nodded at him. After eating, I applied some medicine to Robert's waist. Then I took David out of the hospital room. He was smiling like a Buddha. And had completely forgotten about the little incident. I guess he knew that Robert was autistic. So you are Robert's Jenny. I raised my eyebrows. And invited him to sit down on the chair in the corridor. You know that Of course I know. Let me tell you. Apart from you. I have never seen Robert act like this with anyone else. David was obviously very interested in this gossip. And told me all about my past. 2 years ago. David took Robert to a competition abroad. Robert won the championship trophy without a doubt. He originally thought that this trophy was like the others. And just had it sent to Robert's friend Mary. To be signed for and delivered to Robert's home. Unexpectedly. Robert refused to send it back to China. And just held on to the trophy. So he carried it all the way from South Korea to China. David asked him what he was going to do with it. And he just kept repeating. For Jenny. Before the competition. The kids at our chess club all vowed to win medals for the people they liked. You shouldn't let Robert's indifferent appearance fool you. He knows exactly what he's doing. I wondered if this Jenny was the girl he liked. He looked at me with a smile. I never thought I'd run into her here. I never thought that the trophy in my house still had such a story. It made my heart feel warm. David finished and asked me how Robert's health was. And how long he thought he would be in the hospital for. There would be an international Go competition in China in a few days. He asked if I thought he should enter. I told him that Robert was almost recovered. He would be discharged the next day. He nodded. He stood up to leave. I also stood up. I asked the question that had been on my mind. I feel like I've seen you somewhere before. Did you teach at the Children's Palace in Songqing before? Ever since I met David. I've felt like I've seen him before. Especially that big mole on his chin. I'm sure I've seen him somewhere. David confirmed my suspicion. He pointed to Robert in the ward and said. He has a big mole on his chin. I was a Go teacher at the Children's Palace for a while. This kid is a gem I discovered at the Children's Palace. I followed his gaze to Robert, who was concentrating on the game. Some memories that had faded to gray began to come back to me. After David left, I walked over to Robert and asked softly, Robert, when did we meet? He still had a white piece in his fingers. His long eyelashes fluttered twice when he heard me. Then he slowly turned his head to look at me. And replied with certainty. 10 years old. Robert told me. That when he was 10 years old. He saw me twirling at the Children's Palace. At that time. I did twirl a lot. Since I was young. My mother forced me to learn ballet. Until I went to high school. I basically spent all my holidays at the Children's Palace. It was a time I really hated. I hated being stretched. And twirling. I even hated the face of the dance teacher. Which was so delicate like a doll's. At first. Due to my mother's intimidation. I was able to faithfully report to class on time. But after a while. I got fed up with it all. I started skipping class. I hid in every corner of the youth palace reading comic books. But the teacher always found me. And then came the punishment. Stretching. Spinning. Leg pressing. The worst punishment was when all the other kids had gone home. And I was still spinning in the classroom. When my eyes started to spin, I suddenly caught a glimpse in the full-length mirror of someone standing outside the window facing the corridor. I was so scared. I lost my balance and fell to the ground. Screaming. I sprained my ankle. When I looked up again, I could only see a boy slowly walking past the classroom door carrying a small blue school bag like the ones distributed at the youth center. Because of my injury, I stayed at home comfortably for a month before going back to class. When I circled behind the desk again, I always paid attention to the window, hoping to recognize the hero who let me skip class so openly. But that figure never appeared again. After formally getting to know Robert, I always felt his walking back was familiar. But I couldn't remember where I had seen him. Today, when I saw David's face, the memories in my mind were like scattered pearls. With a thread. They were connected. On the bulletin board of the youth palace, there were big headshots of Robert and David. The face I glanced at when I walked by when I was 14 is now in front of me. So when Mary took you out to dinner with me for the first time, you actually remembered me. Didn't you? I spent the whole lunch break playing chess with Robert. He won 5 games in a row before he smiled and nodded. But you don't do circles anymore. From the tone of your voice, there seems to be some regret. I never imagined that I would enter his world by spinning circles. And couldn't help teasing him on purpose. You don't like it if I can't spin circles. Robert was stunned. And seemed to be really trying to think about this question. After I picked up the chess pieces, I waited patiently for a few minutes. Before I heard him say, even if I can't spin circles, I still like Jenny. His eyes were fixed on the chessboard and he didn't look at me. It's the same kind of love that Dad has for Mum. Seeing you makes me want to hug and kiss you. I want to talk to you about a lot of things. And want to eat, play chess and go to bed with you. Robert gave a lot of detailed examples. I was so flustered that, when he talked about having a baby, I covered his mouth. Okay. I get it. Robert looked at me with sparkling eyes. I blinked innocently. I coughed lightly. And glanced at the lunch break that was about to end. I pursed my lips. And said, we'll talk about the rest later. But I can satisfy you now. With that, I opened my arms wide. And gave him a gentle hug. 2 days later, Robert was discharged from the hospital. Since I happened to be off, I took the opportunity to walk him home. As I was helping him pack and leaving the ward, I saw Richard rubbing the wall and walking towards us. Richard. I walked up to him and held him. Why are you out? I told you to stay in bed. Richard took my hand and stood still. And said with a smile, Sister. I'm fine. I just want to get some fresh air. I'll go back in a while. I firmly said no. His condition is not suitable for activity at all. I was about to send him back to the ward. He said again, Sister. I don't want to go back to the ward now. Can you help me sit on the chair for a while? My eyes twitched slightly. And I finally chose to help him sit on the chair outside the corridor. Robert followed me step by step. It was very quiet. Did something happen? I asked Richard. He smiled gratefully in my direction. And shook his head. It's not a big deal. It's just that the parents of the original cornea donor want to preserve the body. And refuse to donate it. I froze for a moment. I didn't know how to comfort him. It's painful to have hope and then be disappointed. Over the years in the cardio department, I've seen too many similar examples. So my parents are a bit down right now. No matter how I try to comfort them, it's useless. Richard sighed helplessly. And then smiled. You don't have to try to comfort me. Actually, I'm not that disappointed. I just feel a bit sorry for my parents. They've taken care of me for so many years. They were on the verge of being freed. But he didn't say any more. But I already understood what he meant. I didn't say anything. As an outsider, what I say now is just empty words for this family. 4 parents of special families. The effort and love they put into their children is often greater than that of ordinary families. Both Richard's parents and Robert's parents are the same. And the hope that everything will be fine is the driving force in their lives. If you could see what you most want to do, I asked. He paused for a moment and then said, first of all, of course, is to take a good look at my parents and remember every wrinkle on their faces. Then he paused. A light blush appeared on the tips of his ears. Confess to the girl I like. I laughed. Just wanted to tease him. When I heard Robert's voice. Jenny. When can we go? I turned my head and saw Robert sitting next to me with his backpack, looking at me pitifully. Richard followed his gaze. Sis. You guys go ahead. I'll sit here for a while and then go back. He winked in my direction and whispered, your boyfriend seems jealous. I raised my eyebrows and couldn't help reaching out to pinch Robert's cheek. He's actually jealous. That's so sweet. I drove Robert back to his own home. That area is an old residential area with many years of history. There are a lot of cars and people. Although the back has been renovated, the roads are still narrow. It's a 5-minute journey. If no one gives directions, it can take 20 minutes to drive in. I was last here 2 years ago, and I can't remember how to get there anymore. Luckily, I have Robert by my side. It's as if he has a flat map of the entire residential area in his head, and guided me to park my car right below his house in less than 10 minutes. When we arrived at the door, Robert had just opened the combination lock. When the door across the street opened, Mary's head poked out. Her face, which had been smiling, immediately fell when she saw me. She slammed the door with a loud bang. Robert didn't even lift an eyebrow the whole time. He left the door open as wide as it would go, but didn't go in. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the ground. I lifted my foot and walked in. The decorations and the way the objects were arranged were exactly the same as they had been 2 years ago. Robert followed me in and shut the door. He then stood still again. I turned around and looked at him with my arms folded. Robert, are you happy now? He pursed his lips and nodded reservedly and said, yes. I took a step forward and leaned in closer to him. Then why aren't you smiling? And why aren't you talking to me? In front of me. He had subconsciously begun to play the role of a quiet, normal person. But from the car to now, when we had entered the house, although Robert was trying hard to suppress the corner of his mouth, he didn't look at me much. But the occasional glance revealed his thoughts. It was the kind of look you get when you've finally brought home a treasure you've been waiting for a long time. And it made my heart beat a little faster. After hearing what I said, Robert's mouth curled up a little more. His eyes lit up. He looked at me. Jenny, can I hug you? I smiled and opened my arms, letting him come over and put his arms around my waist and hold me in his arms. It was so cute it was almost wrong. I wanted the rest of the day. I stayed at Robert's house and never went out again. Robert's life was very regular. After lunch, he took a nap. Then he spent the whole afternoon playing chess. He was very focused. He would only look up at me when I got up to make sure I wasn't leaving. Then he would continue playing chess. I stayed with him and continued to study the information about autism that I had gotten from friends and learn about the more famous psychologists in the country. Robert's situation required professional psychological assessment and the establishment of long-term psychological treatment. This continued until dark. After dinner, I just picked up my bag, and Robert stood up nervously. I looked at him with teary eyes. I really couldn't bring myself to say I was leaving. I squeezed the strap of my handbag and looked away. I'll go back first. I'll come and see you tomorrow. What time tomorrow? The concept of tomorrow was too vague for him. I thought about it, and as I walked towards the door I said, I have to work tomorrow during the day. I'll come and see you for dinner tomorrow night. Robert said very quietly. Followed me to the door, watched me put on my shoes, and opened the door. Jenny. I stayed the night at Robert's place. But there was only one bed in the house. After I'd washed up, He was already lying in the middle of the bed. I asked him where I was going to sleep. He pointed to the living room. You're 168 centimeters tall. The sofa is 250 centimeters long and 98 centimeters wide. It can sleep you. Why don't you sleep on the sofa and I'll sleep in the bed? I asked back. Robert sat up. This is my bed. I choked. Then I'll go. He was anxious. He quickly sat up, hugged the quilt and pillows, and moved to the left side of the bed. Then he patted the empty right side. My bed is half yours. I looked at his big, innocent eyes and thought, I'd better carry the quilt and pillows to the sofa. I walked out of the bedroom with my front foot, and the bedroom light turned off with my back foot. Robert's cheerful voice rang out in the darkness. Good night, Jenny. Good night. Early the next morning, Robert and I had breakfast together before going to work. But as soon as I entered the office, I sensed that the atmosphere was not quite right. My colleagues, who had been gathered together whispering, scattered as soon as they saw me come in. I was puzzled. I was about to send Thomas a message to ask what was going on, when I was called away by the director. He took me directly to the vice president's office. When I came out again, I fully understood what was going on. It turned out that I had been falsely accused by a malicious person of personal misconduct. I had been seen fraternizing with patients during working hours. The letter of accusation had not only been delivered to the door of the president's office, but also posted on the hospital bulletin board. Now the whole hospital, including the patients, must know Jenny's name. It's obvious who did this. Thomas sent me a lot of messages, and told me more or less the same thing as I did in the dean's office. I asked him to come and see me after his afternoon break. What did the hospital say? As soon as we met, he asked me, in the dean's tone of voice, Jenny, this rumor has a very bad influence, and has caused great damage to your personal image and the hospital's image. You are required to write a statement and submit it to me today. I will then issue a public announcement to explain to everyone. Thomas laughed loudly, and asked me again why I had called him. Did I know who was behind it? That was why I had called you. I waved at him to come closer to me, and took out my mobile phone, and looked up a series of phone numbers in the memo. I told him my plan. He laughed from ear to ear, and agreed without saying a word. Everything was ready. Thomas used his mobile phone to make the call, and then followed what I had taught him, word for word to the person on the other end of the line. Mary baby, since we last met at the hotel, I've been thinking about you. Are you free these days? I found a hotel with a couple's theme. We can choose a waterbed. I have to say Thomas has some talent for acting. I couldn't help but give him a thumbs up from the side. The man on the other end was silent for 2 seconds after hearing this. Then he roared. Who are you? What did Mary do behind my back? Thomas quickly pretended to be flustered and said it was a wrong number. He hung up. This was the first time I had seen the sunny boy be so bad. I couldn't help but praise him again. Originally, when Mary broke up Robert and I hadn't had time to settle scores with her. But now she actually had the nerve to come looking for trouble with me. Then I can't be blamed for settling old scores as well as new ones. It's also quite a coincidence. When I left Robert's house today, I saw a car that looked familiar. It looked a lot like the one Mary was leaning on while talking to a man in front of the hospital that day. So I kept a close eye on it. I copied the phone number for the car on the windshield. Unexpectedly, it was really Mary's boyfriend, Thomas. He put away his phone and shook his head with a smile. Don't flatter yourself. You're buying coffee this afternoon. No problem. I immediately pulled out my phone and ordered takeaway. He came over again and asked in a low voice, have you and your ex got back together? I paused and said while swiping my phone, not really. As soon as I finished speaking, another voice in my head rang out. What do you want if you're not getting back together? Don't you want to get back together? Not really. I want to stay with Robert. But as I said, I'm not sure if I like him as a person, or if I like the feeling of being needed by him. Besides, I'm very busy at work, and sometimes it's normal for me not to go home for a day or two at the hospital. I'm worried that I won't be able to take good care of him. About this question. My own mind is now in a mess. And I don't want to talk to Thomas anymore. So I changed the subject and asked. I also want to ask. Why did you study autism? Thomas smiled, leaned on my desk, and looked out the window at the blue sky. Because my father is an autistic person. I froze. And looked up at him. A tall, handsome young man. Dressed neatly in a clean white lab coat. With a firm gaze. And a straight back. Unlike Thomas at all. He made a stop sign gesture. Don't look at me like that. Our family is quite well off. I'm researching this purely out of personal curiosity. He paused. And caught my puzzled gaze. The clinical manifestations of autism are social interaction disorders and communication disorders. They are like Jenny. Shining alone in the sky. Living in their own world. But their world is not without a key. Just like my dad to my mom. Your ex-boyfriend to you. You are both the ones holding the key. I'm just curious what this key is. After he finished. He looked at me again. His world is opening up to you. If you really like him. Don't keep him waiting. I lowered my eyes. Staring at the petals spinning in the glass of water. Nodding slowly. Thomas stood up straight and stretched. Speaking for his rival. I'm kind of a one-off. I looked up and smiled. Telling him to hurry up. Lunch break is almost over. He waved at me. Walked to the door and turned back. I heard that things haven't been peaceful in your department these past few days. You should be careful. I tilted my chin slightly. To indicate that I had heard. Who hasn't encountered a doctor-patient dispute after spending a long time in the hospital? This is something that cannot be avoided. A year ago. The cardiothoracic surgery department admitted a patient with dilated cardiomyopathy. Who needed a heart transplant. The person had been waiting for a year. And had already been matched with a heart donor. However. They received notification yesterday that the first hospital had a critically ill patient who had also been matched with a donor. The heart was given priority by the system. The patient's family couldn't bear the truth. And broke down. And has been arguing with the attending doctor for 2 days. After work. I couldn't wait to rush back to where Robert was. All the way. My mind kept thinking about the words Thomas said. I'm very lucky. Ever since Robert was 10 years old. His world has been open to me. And I made him wait for 15 years. Only to leave after 1 year. Just thinking about it. Now he's still alone in his own world. My chest feels heavy. The room door opened. I saw Robert sitting on the balcony by the chessboard. The sunset behind him filled the entire sky. He turned his head and saw me. He smiled. Jenny. You're back. At this moment. I felt like I understood everything. What is it about being relied on that I like? If I didn't like Robert as a person, how could I willingly be relied on by him wholeheartedly? I didn't have so many concerns. I just love him. I fell in love with him at first sight. Whenever I see him, I know exactly how I want to spend the rest of my life with him. I just love Robert. I threw my bag on the sofa. And rushed to the balcony. Throwing myself into his arms. I wrapped my arms around his neck. His body stiffened for a moment. Before he slowly raised his hands. And carefully embraced me. After a while. He whispered in my ear. Jenny. Take off your shoes when you come in. After we've hugged enough. I'll go change my shoes. Then I'll go to the kitchen and prepare dinner. Before long. The doorbell rang. I was cutting vegetables and didn't have time. So I told Robert to go answer the door. The door opened. But after 10 minutes. I didn't hear him close the door. I stopped what I was doing. And went out. I saw that the room door was ajar. And there were voices outside. I leaned closer and listened. It was Mary's voice. Robert. You have to believe me. Jenny never liked you. Do you know why she hasn't looked for you in the past 2 years? Because she doesn't like you. She has long forgotten you. In no time at all. She will leave you too. No matter what she says. Robert remained silent. Until she was exasperated and said. What kind of magic has that vixen Jenny cast over you? Robert's voice carried anger. Don't swear at Jenny. You go. I curled my lips. Opened the door and leaned against the frame. Looking up and down at Mary. Oh, is your ring gone? It doesn't look cheap. Mary obviously didn't know I was here. And after a moment of shock, she gritted her teeth. Mind your own business. Judging by the look of things, I think it's safe to say that the relationship has gone sour. After she finished speaking, it was as if she had suddenly realized something. Her already angry face looked even more hideous. So it was you who was behind this? I sneered. I don't provoke trouble. But I won't let it pass. If you dare to spread rumors again, we'll see each other in court. Oh, by the way, Robert, remember to return the trophies from the previous competition. Embezzling someone else's property is also grounds for a lawsuit. Some people. It's clear that she was only asked to hold on to something. But she took it and kept it for herself. TSK. Mary's face turned green. She stormed back into the house. Bang. I told Robert to come in and eat. He followed me into the kitchen and hooked the strap of the apron I was wearing. 15 days left. I didn't react at first. Then it came to me. 15 days left until I told him whether I liked him or not. He didn't believe Mary. He was waiting to hear it from me. I blinked. I wanted to tell him right away. But then I suddenly remembered that there was still half a month to go until the Go competition David had mentioned. 2 years ago, Robert and I had exchanged tokens of our love. And they were trophies. So this time, I decided to do the same. So I told Robert that the day you bring home the Go competition trophy, I'll tell you. Robert's eyes lit up. Well, half a month later, Robert won the Go competition. He was holding the trophy when he picked me up from work outside the hospital. Stand still there. I'll be right down. I looked through the office window. I saw him looking up with his neck stretched. My mouth couldn't help but turn up at the corners. I took off my lab coat as fast as I could, turned off my computer and ran downstairs. But as soon as I got out of the elevator, I heard a loud scream. Everyone in the lobby was running towards the door. A bad feeling came over me. I took 2 steps into the middle of the hall and saw a man jump out of nowhere. There was blood all over him. He was holding a knife. He was chasing people like crazy and swinging the knife around. My mind was in a panic. I thought about Robert, who was still standing outside. I saw the man running towards the door. Without thinking, I followed him. No, Robert. Please don't be hurt. I prayed as I ran. Robert saw the others running away and followed suit. But when I arrived at the door as quickly as I could, I saw that Robert was still standing in the same place. The man had already gone in the direction of Robert. He saw me and smiled at me. In that moment, I forgot to breathe. My mind was still reeling. When the words came out of my mouth, "Run," I ran towards him, while waving my hands and shouting as loud as I could, "Run." But it was too late. The man had already reached Robert. Robert. My heart stopped. I watched him fall to the ground. There were all kinds of screams around me. I rushed over and caught Robert's body at the last minute. I helped him fall, pressed my hand on his wound, and called his name over and over. Robert. Robert. The knife plunged into Robert's body. And it was as if it had plunged into my own. I was in so much pain that I could hardly breathe. My consciousness was fading. Any sound around me seemed to recede into the distance. I could only instinctively yell out to the side. "Stretcher. Bring the stretcher over here quickly." Not far away, a group of security guards had already arrived and were holding the man down. He was struggling frantically. "You have taken my son's heart. My son is dead. You will all die with him." The stretcher was soon brought over. I followed it to the door of the operating room. I was stopped there. My colleague patted my shoulder and hurried into the operating room. The door slowly closed. I stared at the door. My mind went blank. I never thought that one day I would be locked outside this door. And inside lay the person I love most. The hospital was filled with wailing. A place that was supposed to save lives had become a purgatory because of a medical dispute. My legs grew weak. I fell to the ground. My hands were covered in Robert's bright red blood. "Robert. You must be okay. I haven't even told you that I like you." The operation lasted a long time. During that time, Thomas came to see me, to offer some words of comfort. But he left in a hurry. The sudden change in events caused a sharp increase in the number of emergency cases in the hospital. But I couldn't care less. As long as Robert is still in there for even 1 minute. I'm not going anywhere. Finally. 4 hours later. The operation was over. Someone walked out. I wanted to stand up. But my legs had no strength at all. I even started to hear ringing in my ears. I heard someone say, "The situation is not optimistic. Whether or not he can pull through depends on the next 2 days." Robert was wheeled into. I originally wanted to go in and keep him company. The vice president came to me and asked me to get back to work. He said he would let me know the first thing if Robert had any problems. I didn't move. I didn't want to go anywhere. I just wanted to wait for Robert to wake up. "Jenny. You are a doctor." He yelled at me. "Your colleague is also lying on the operating table. Whether it is out of collegiality or out of your duty as a doctor, you have to save him." I laughed. I laughed until my tears came out. How ridiculous. My colleague. I save lives. Undertake hardships. For colleagues who believe. Were stabbed by the patient's family. Lying on the operating table he knew so well. Nothing could be more ridiculous. What had he done wrong? What had my Robert done wrong? He had clearly just been waiting patiently for me to finish work. Now his life was in the balance. As we stood there. Frozen. The director. Who had been away on a course. Returned to the hospital. He didn't say anything. He took the deputy director by the arm and left. I sat outside the room for half an hour. Then I changed my clothes and went in. I looked at Robert lying there on the bed. Next to him were all kinds of machines. Many tubes were connected to his body. His eyes were closed. As if he were asleep. I walked softly over to him and sat down. And took his hand. Every minute and every second here seemed unbearably long. I was completely absorbed in monitoring his vital signs. I dared not take my eyes off him. Or doze off. I don't know how long it was. Thomas came in and asked me to go out and get something to eat. I refused. He left a bottle of water and went away. It wasn't until Robert's vital signs had stabilized. And the danger had passed. That I felt like I was finally coming back to life and walked out. As soon as I reached the door. I felt dizzy. And when I woke up again. I saw Robert's face. Lying in the next bed to mine. He had already been transferred out. I wanted to go closer to take a look at him. But Thomas, who had just walked in, stopped me. "How dare you? He's fine. You eat something first." It was the first time I saw him speak so harshly. He put my bed up. And put some pillows behind me. Then he brought a bowl of congee to me. I didn't have much of an appetite. I held the spoon and stirred a few times. And then looked away to see Robert. He was still asleep. Thomas softened his tone. And advised me with all the sincerity he could muster. "You can't even take care of yourself. How can you take care of him?" I glanced at him. And lifted the bowl of porridge to my mouth and gulped it down. Robert opened his eyes the next morning. But he wasn't in good shape. He was in and out of consciousness. Despite the fact that he had already had 2 operations in a row. The risk of post-operative complications was high. I tried to do everything myself. To make sure nothing went wrong. 2 days later. My colleague. Who had been stabbed by the patient's family. Eventually passed away. He left. That night. Robert seemed to be in a better condition. And asked for his trophy while holding my hand. He asked me if I had received it. I said. I had. The trophy was quite heavy. And I almost dropped it when I took it. He paused. And looked at me without blinking. He asked again. "Jenny. Do you like me?" My eyes welled up. I nodded firmly. "I like you." He smiled. He lifted my hand and turned it over. He drew a heart in my palm. Then he passed out again. Mary got the news somehow. And came to the hospital to find me. She questioned me about why Robert had become like this. I didn't bother to answer her. I wanted to go into the ward to be with Robert. But she wouldn't let me go. As we were struggling. The machine next to Robert suddenly started beeping rapidly. I pushed Mary away and rushed in. I found that Robert was showing symptoms of multiple organ failure. So I quickly called the nurse and pushed him to the operating room. When we arrived at the door of the operating room, Mary, who had been following me, stopped me. "You are not allowed to operate on him. Let the best doctor in your hospital do it." I pointed directly at the two interns next to me. "No one else is available. These two. Choose one." I taught them both. She looked back and forth between us helplessly. And suddenly let go of me. I collapsed to the ground and burst into tears. "Jenny. Please save Robert. If he gets better, I'll never show my face in front of you again." I turned around and ran into the operating room. And quickly finished the preparations. But I saw the director already standing on the operating table. He was trying to save his colleague. And had also not slept much for several days. "Director. I'll do it." I walked up to him. And he kept working. "You be the assistant." I saw that he had already picked up the scalpel. So I had to walk over to him. An hour later. The machine beeped. Its sound, resounding throughout the operating room. Robert's heart stopped. Stopped beating. I kept my expression neutral. As if I hadn't heard. I continued with my movements. The director took me by the arm. "Jenny. We've done all we can." "Director. Let me try again." I looked up at him calmly. "Please. Let me try again. Just once." The whole operating room was silent. No one said a word. The director sighed. He took my hand. And led me out. Half an hour later. I was walking alone down the corridor to the office. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I just wanted to keep walking. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out and answered it. My mother's voice immediately came through. "Why did it take you so long to answer the phone? I just got out of surgery." She didn't say anything. She went on talking to herself. "Your Aunt Zhang wants to introduce you to someone. The person is in San Francisco. You should make time to meet them at the weekend. I've sent you the time and address and the person's contact details. I've sent it to you on WeChat." I didn't say anything. I walked step by step. She said again. "I'm talking to you. Do you hear me?" I walked to the window in the corridor. Looking out the window at the flocks of geese flying towards the sunset. "I want to find someone to love and get married," I said. She looked like she had no temper. With a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "So hurry up and find someone." "I found someone," I said. There was silence on the other end of the phone. I said again. "But he's dead." My mother still didn't say anything. But I suddenly felt a piercing pain in my chest. So much pain that I could hardly breathe. So much pain that tears flowed out of my eyes uncontrollably. I bent down. Squatted on the ground. Opened my mouth and breathed in deeply. And helplessly called over and over again into the phone. "Mom. Mom. The person I love is dead. He's lying on the operating table. But I couldn't save him. Couldn't save him. I'm so exhausted." I sat down on the floor. Buried my head in my knees. And couldn't say anything anymore. I don't understand why. Why I've saved so many people. But in the end, I couldn't even save the one I love the most. A month later. I just woke up from a dream. But the sudden bright light made me close my eyes again. Up for dinner. The curtains in my room had been pulled open by my mother. And the windows were open. A flood of smells and sounds came in. Someone's braised pork was burning. Someone's kid was crying again after being beaten. My mother was banging around in my room with a vacuum cleaner. "If you really don't want to work anymore, go sell medicine at your uncle's company. Don't just hide in bed like a maggot every day." I rolled over. And pulled the quilt over my head. And fell asleep in the midst of the chaos. I don't know how long I slept. A doorbell woke me up again. I waited for a long time. But I didn't hear my mother open the door. And the doorbell kept ringing persistently. 5 minutes later. I got up and opened the door. I saw Thomas's hand. Which was about to knock on the door. When he saw me. A flash of dismay crossed his eyes. And he slowly withdrew his hand. I poked my head out the door. And didn't intend to invite him in to sit down. "Why?" My voice was hoarse after not speaking for a long time. He froze for a moment. And said. "Change your clothes. I want to take you somewhere." I didn't say anything. And slammed the door shut. He held it shut. And said urgently. It's about Robert. I stopped what I was doing and turned around to go into my room. I threw a jacket over my pajamas and left the house without changing my shoes. I didn't bother asking Thomas where we were going, and he just drove in silence. The quiet surroundings made me fall asleep again after another sleepless night. When I opened my eyes again, Thomas had already parked the car in front of the hospital in San Jose. I didn't even bother to get out of the car and sent me home. Thomas didn't answer and pointed to a milk tea shop across the street from the hospital. Look who's there. I squinted and looked over and saw a familiar face. Richard. His eyes seemed to have recovered, and he was smiling at the girl sitting across from him. Thomas said next to me. Robert was in and out of consciousness for a while, and looked for him once, and said he wanted to donate his corneas to Richard. He said, I'm worried that after I go back to Jenny's world, I won't be able to see my Jenny anymore. If my corneas can help Richard see, I want to ask him to help me see my Jenny more. I spread my palm and remember the Jenny that Robert drew in the palm of my hand. At first I thought he was calling me, but it turns out he was trying to tell me that he was going to turn into a Jenny and go back to Jenny's world, just like his parents. I stared at Richard's eyes for a long time. So long that all I could see in my mind was the way Robert looked at me. Once, Robert's eyes only had me in them, but now they looked at another girl and had nothing to do with me anymore. A few tears welled up in my eyes. I wiped them away with my hand, opened the car door and got out. Thomas called out to me from behind. What are you doing? Quitting. From the moment Robert's heart stopped beating, I could save no one except myself.